London from here, and I'm glad to be here in Taiwan for the first time. What I will introduce is the new consensus that's not so new. In fact, it was published at the beginning of this year. That's called European Working Group of Sarcopenia in Older People 2. And I will show you how it came up and what are the differences and what were the problems that were trying to be solved with this consensus. This is a couple of conflict of interests. You know that the concept of sarcopenia is not an old one. This is the first conference that had the name of sarcopenia within its title, and it's only in 1994. And if you read some of the definitions at that time, sarcopenia was related with muscle, not only with muscle mass, but also with quality and strength, and it was also related to frailty. That was the general concept. If you start reading any paper on sarcopenia now, except very few from experts who are in the room, the first sentence is there's no accepted definition of sarcopenia. And I get really angry when I read that, because this is already old, but if you go to Google Scholar or to PubMed or to any other place and look at the citations, some of the definitions that have been published are widely used worldwide. The European definition in 2010 had 1 year ago more than 5,000 citations. The Asian, which goes exactly in the same line but with cutoffs, an additional 1,001. And the International Working Group, which had also a very similar definition, more than 1,500. So I think we do have some definitions that of course have to be improved, but you can't say there's no definition of sarcopenia. So please, if you write a paper on sarcopenia, don't start saying that. And the same is true for frailty. There was a major change in the field in 2010. What happened this year? In 2010 and around, also next year, there were 4 definitions of sarcopenia trying to encompass all that had been published before and put it together and try to show the way. In order, this was the oldest one. It was published by ESPEN, the European Nutrition Society, and in fact it was a definition of cachexia. But within this paper there was also a definition of sarcopenia to differentiate sarcopenia from cachexia. The next one was the European Working Group of Sarcopenia. This was published in Age Aging and has been the highest cited paper there. I will show you there. Then the International Working Group that had people from the United States and also from Europe and other countries around the world, that was led, organizers there a meeting in Rome. John Morley was part of it. He's here in the room also, and Roy Fielding. And the last one was led by John Morley again. It was different. It was the only one that instead of calling sarcopenia to something that includes muscle function, they use the name sarcopenia with limited mobility, although this term has not been used after that. What's the difference? You know, John, you can look for the citation. The difference is, up to that moment, in most papers written, you found sarcopenia, as I mentioned, to name muscle wasting, low muscle mass. And after this, all these papers had in common that they also included function, muscle function. You still now read papers where sarcopenia is used to name low muscle mass, but it's mostly, if you find these articles in the fields of organ specialties, in oncology, nephrology, surgery, they still name it sarcopenia in the old way, but not in people who are in sarcopenia research. And you're in a sarcopenia conference, you probably know that. The European definition was quite successful, as I told you. If you look, these were the highest citations in Age Aging, which is a journal that's more than 60 years old at that time when it was published. And if you look at the citations, the metrics, that's a couple of months ago, it's already 4,000, which is much more than any other paper published in Age Aging. I think it was a successful definition and quite widely used. So the question is, it's only 2019. In 9 years, do we really need a new definition of sarcopenia? And again, so people say we don't have a definition. To answer the question, we have to look at two things. What do we know and what do we agree, and what do we still don't know, or where do we need additional information? I think everybody now in the field agrees that sarcopenia is not only low muscle mass. Low muscle mass can be a part of cachexia, it's now in part a part of the definition of malnutrition, so per se it cannot be a disease. Function is relevant. The second aspect is a syndromic approach. Sarcopenia is not a single disease like a chromosomal disease. It's more like a syndrome, like heart failure, like other organ diseases that has many interacting paths that lead into sarcopenia. The third, and it's been clearly shown since this definition was published, is that sarcopenia is linked with adverse outcomes. So if you define a patient as being sarcopenic, you know that patient has a high risk of death, a high risk of functional problems at least, and a high risk of falls. So what are the problems that have to be addressed? First, if you look at the name of the group, it's sarcopenia in older people. It was basically based in geriatric medicine. But it's now quite clear that sarcopenia starts earlier. And you have to tackle sarcopenia starting from early life. There are even studies from genetic studies and linking your weight when you're at birth with sarcopenia. So we have to start looking earlier and not only in old age. And this is an important aspect. The second is, it's becoming quite clear that even with a syndromic view, you need to understand sarcopenia as a muscle disease. Of course, the muscle is not the muscle isolated, as any other organ are not isolated, and it has some links with bone, and you'll hear about this later on. It has links with the neurological control. It has other links, but basically you have to look at it as a muscle problem. The major issue in all the definitions you've seen and the new ones that have been released is a problem in measuring muscle mass. All the measures we have for muscle mass to date are inaccurate. And this inaccuracy makes them not being linked to outcomes. Now the D3 creatine dilution is coming, and it seems to be promising, but it's not mainstream. So if you measure, in fact you don't measure, you estimate muscle mass, even if you use CT or MRI, you're not doing a nice job because it's not accurate really. And also, we always talk about muscle quality, but we don't know exactly what's that or how to measure muscle quality. There's another issue is that we haven't agreed whether the outcome measures for interventions. If you improve sarcopenia in any way, with any measure, with exercise, nutrition, or drugs, what do you expect to improve that's relevant for the patient? And finally, and this is important, many of the people in this group are clinicians, and we see patients, and we see that sarcopenia has not reached clinical practice. People are not being diagnosed with sarcopenia, and nobody's doing anything with people who are diagnosed with sarcopenia. So this is a major problem. Perhaps we made it too complicated in the former definitions. Now you have to understand that to define a disease, a new disease in this 21st century, definitions of diseases come from the 19th century, most of them, you need to define many aspects. Parameters, variables, measurement instruments, and cutoff points. And this is not easy. There are problems. For instance, in the parameters, what do you measure? Muscle mass? Do you measure muscle strength? Do you measure physical performance? What's exactly physical performance? Because this is a compose that includes other aspects that are far away from the muscle. Do we have to measure that? In our definition, physical performance was part of the definition, but the Americans in the NIH said that this was an outcome measure. So what do you include in your definition? Once you decide you've included that, how do you measure? What's a variable you measure? For instance, for muscle mass, do you look for total, regional, appendicular, a single muscle? If you look for muscle strength, what muscle or group of muscles are you looking for and including in your definition? Once you decide on that, you need to say, how do you measure? If you talk about muscle mass, anthropometry is very inaccurate. BIA, DEXA, CT, how do you measure that? What's the instrument you use for anything? And once you decide the instrument for the variable and the parameter, then you need to define what are the cutoff points, how do they behave in reference populations, and how do they behave in clinical practice. And all of these have to be related with outcomes. But which outcomes? You also need to define which are the outcome variables that are relevant for that disease. This is what underlies any definition of any disease. But it's complex because you need a lot of decisions, and in many cases, these decisions are arbitrary because you don't have the data. And this is true for other conditions. For instance, it's very clear in hypertension. The way we measure blood pressure everywhere is not the best. Now people are going for 24 hours in home care and home control and everything, but in fact we're not measuring intra-arterial blood pressure, which is the real parameter, because it's not practical. So you make decisions every time in medicine when you design and when you define diseases. This is the first slide we used for the new meeting of the European Working Group of Sarcopenia. And this is part of the people who met. We met in a very relevant place because it's the University of Alcalá de Henares, one of the oldest in Spain, close to Madrid. And this old building, you see, the old building has been blended with new buildings. So it's very symbolic, the old and the new blend together. This was the group that met. We tried to expand the expertise by including people in more areas that were not underrepresented, and by including more women and more young people in the group from different countries. And this was finally the core group that was called the writing group, but it was also, the authors of this paper are also an extended group. I'll show you. We have here Francesco Landis in the room, one of the members. And this was paid by Abbott. Abbott paid the EWGMS to produce this. Nobody got any payment, or there was no direct interaction, but you have to know that. And the writer, I have to acknowledge Cecilia, who was the medical writer for the first paper. She's American, and we asked her to be part of the effort because she's one of the best medical writers we know for this. And this is the extended group. The role was to check everything was going correctly and to give input to all the things that were written. Jean-Pierre Michel is part of the group, and so also here. And as you see, most Europe is represented. This is a European definition. And this is the only definition that is strongly supported by many international scientific societies. I know there are more definitions, including the new one coming from the United States, but one of the things you want for a definition is who supports that. And in this case, EWGMS, the European Geriatric Society, the European Nutrition Society, and also the IUF and SEO, which are international societies on bone and muscle, and also IAGG, the International Society for Gerontology. So this is a strongly supported definition. It's endorsed by all these societies. And this is the paper that was published at the beginning of this year in AJANE. It's called European Working Group 2. We had to name it to make it easier to publish. So we recommend using this, all these letters. It may be even more complex to you from Asia than for me, but this is with the number 2. The paper is free to download, so if you go to AJANE, it's free. You don't have to have a subscription. What are the changes, the main changes or the important issues or items in this definition? If you look at the conceptual definition, it says that sarcopenia is progressive and generalized skeletal muscle disorder that's associated with outcomes. We were very strict in saying this is only a disease if it leads you to things you don't want to have. That's adverse outcomes. So this is important. And we define in the paper the concept of muscle failure. When you go back to your hospitals and you try, or your universities, and you try to explain to the nephrologist or to other people, say you have renal failure, you have heart failure, and we have muscle failure. Why we call this sarcopenia. The neurologists say they have the brain failure, that's dementia, and it's acute, it's delirium. So we all have the failure of the organ that's usually multidimensional, and this is the case for sarcopenia, and it's an easy way to explain. This is the old definition. In the old definition, we put muscle mass in the center. And then if there was a problem with muscle function or body function defined as performance, we call that sarcopenia. And if both were present, we call that severe sarcopenia. The concept of pre-sarcopenia is mostly abandoned because it's not the best term to define low lean lines. What's new here? The new aspect is we put function first. Much the same case that had happened with heart failure. Heart mass is not as relevant as heart function. And here it's the same. So if you have low muscle strength, you call that probable sarcopenia. Of course, many people have low muscle strength for other reasons. Many or not so many. For instance, arthritis in the hand when you're measuring. But at least you have to suspect there's a problem there. If you have someone with fever, you suspect infection. And of course, it can be other things, but mostly it's infection. It's the same way of thinking. And if you show that there's a problem in the muscle, either in the quantity, and we decided to use that word better than mass, because the concept of mass, I told you, is quite tricky, or in quality, and we don't have measures of quality, but they are coming, so this definition may apply in a couple of years, then we call that sarcopenia. The muscle is not working, and there's a problem in the muscle that's derived. And when did we put physical performance? We decided to put it away from the core definition, but not yet as an outcome, as the Americans suggested a couple of years ago, but to use it to define severity. If this muscle problem takes you into a whole body problem of performance that's usually measured with the SPPB, time up and go walking, then we call that sarcopenia is severe because it has a real impact in your life. So that's the new definition. As you see, there's a change. Instead of muscle mass first, muscle strength first. The second aspect is we wanted to go to clinical practice and to give clear recommendations to practitioners, primary care physicians and colleague geriatricians around. So how do you suspect sarcopenia? Two ways. First, if any symptom of sarcopenia appears, then you have to check if sarcopenia is part of the problem, the equation. What are the symptoms? Falling, feeling weak, difficulty rising from a chair, walking slowly, or losing weight. If you have any of these symptoms, you have to suspect that sarcopenia may be part of that problem of that patient. And then you have to look for sarcopenia, as you may look, if you have weight loss, you may have to look for malnutrition or for cancer or other things, but also look for sarcopenia then. And if you want to screen for that, you can use the Sarcef, and there's a talk on Sarcef later on as a screening instrument for that. How do you measure each of these parameters? And this is difficult, as I told you, but mostly we recommend using hand grip strength, which is easy. The device is not that expensive. Usually it's a JAMA, but there are other devices that can be alternatives depending on the workplace you work. And hand grip is very well correlated with leg strength, and it's correlated with outcomes. That's why we recommend it. It's very simple to measure in clinical practice in your clinic. It doesn't take more time than measuring blood pressure. That's the issue. What if you don't have the device? An alternative, even if it's not strictly a muscle strength test, would be the chest stand test. It's not exactly the same, but the chest stand test, which is part of the SPPB, can be an alternative if you're, for instance, in the home of a patient and you don't have the device with you to measure strength. What about mass? At this moment, we recommend using DEXA to estimate. But remember, it's an estimation and it's inaccurate. The same DEXA measured by the same technician in the same session twice by getting the image. If the technician changes the dot that defines appendicular mass just a little bit, will change more than 3%, which is more than the effect of any intervention today. So it's not very accurate, you have to know that. And what for physical performance? This is more clear. Gait speed, SPPB, or timed up and go are good alternatives. And they are all simple to perform and fast and can be done in the clinic. 400-meter walk test is mostly used in research, and it's an excellent outcome. It's been used in the LIFE study, and it's used in the Sprint T trial that will be published next year. That's a European randomized controlled trial. Of course, the paper defines tools that are coming. We don't know which one will show the best properties. But for instance, people in oncology are measuring, using CT to measure spinal mass, a cut of the muscles in the lumbar vertebra. We also have the ultrasounds, we have the creatine dilution test, and we have biomarkers coming, markers of quality of life. If you're interested, you can go through the paper and then read what's happening and what's being published after that. In the first consensus, we made an error. We revised all the cutoff points published today. We put long tables in the paper. But people are using the European definition, 2010 definition, and ask if it had cutoff points. And you read, according to the cutoff points of the European definition, that's not true. They just took the first of each table. But that's not correct. The Asians were much more clever and said, we offer cutoff points for Asia. So they used the framework of the European definition with cutoff points, and they were much more successful. So this time we took the Asian line and we suggested cutoff points. And please remember that what we did is to try to put it practical. Some groups are trying to define the exact cutoff point with lots of decimals. They're trying to link that with outcomes. But imagine I told you that the right blood pressure was 119.67. Look below, it's useless. So we went to clear numbers that you can remember, not looking at them each time you make the measure. Grip strength, 27 and 16. Chest stand more than 15 seconds. Appendicular mass, less than 20 at 15. And corrected by Hay, 7.5. And by the way, I have to say there's an error there in the paper. In the original paper, it says 6.5. There's an erratum, and the real figure is 5.5. It was just an erratum in the first paper. So be careful. If you use the original, you have to read the erratum, and that's the real change. As you see, they're not very accurate. It's not 7.11. And this may be a critic, but what we wanted is to define people who have clear sarcopenia. We will move the line later, as people in diabetes or blood pressure have done. But let's identify people who have definite sarcopenia. We're sure those people are sick. And then we'll learn more about how, but let's start treating patients soon. And these are the cutoff points for the physical performance measures. They're quite standard. They're on the paper, you don't have to remember. But as you see, they're quite easy, 0.88, 20 seconds. Quite easy to remember. And this is the new algorithm. In the first paper, we had an algorithm for case finding. But many people thought it was an algorithm for definition. So this time we proposed an algorithm for definition. So you suspect cases where you use a Sarcopenia, and this is normal, so you don't think there's sarcopenia there, you will screen in the future. If any of these problems are present, you measure muscle strength. If it's normal, it's okay. The symptoms you have to look elsewhere. But if it's abnormal, it's slow, then you say this is probable sarcopenia. And then you have to explore and do things already. If you want to confirm, you measure muscle quality of quantity, usually estimate muscle mass. And if it's normal and still you have low muscle strength, it may be an error of the instrument, or it may be that the patient has other causes for low muscle strength. But you still have to do things in a patient who has low muscle strength. This patient has a problem. And if you have both low strength and quantity, you say sarcopenia is confirmed. And you can use a measure of severity, because those who have non-severe sarcopenia may improve with simple interventions. But those who have severe sarcopenia will probably need complex multidimensional interventions. So this is important. We also mentioned in the paper the time course, using this graph that's known by you for osteoporosis and for the relation between muscle mass and frailty. Unfortunately, for muscle strength, we have normative data. This is a paper from UK, from Richard Dodds and Alfonso, where you see that this normative data from populations resemble the theoretical model of loss of muscle mass and strength. You know that this line is much faster, the loss is much faster for strength than for mass. So it's, again, relevant. We decided to keep the categories of sarcopenia because if you go to clinical practice, you want to have a list of things to look at. So if the patient is sarcopenic, you can say, it's only aging, or is there a disease that's there? Is there an inactivity that's present? Is there malnutrition that's present? So it's easier for you to look at the different items. You have to look in a sarcopenic to do the correct diagnosis in a syndromic way, as I told you. And we also define, and this is new, acute and chronic sarcopenia. Why? Because it's quite clear that some people lose mass very fast, usually in the setting of acute hospitalization or acute disease or acute immobility, and people who lose muscle strength very slowly a long time due to chronic diseases or even aging. So we decided to set the threshold in 6 months. If sarcopenia develops fast, then we call that acute sarcopenia. Probably interventions are different and more preventive than if you go to chronic sarcopenia, where you have to look for underlying causes, and probably the intervention will be slower and has to be more intensive. And this also underscores the need that you need repeated assessments. You can't just say, this patient has sarcopenia and never again. You need to measure regularly, even if the patient is healthy, regularly, and find out if the patient gets sarcopenia. The paper finally mentions some gaps in research. And this is a list. How can we identify those at high risk apart from clinical suspicion? Can we improve SARC? Do we need to do screening of populations or subgroups of populations? We need more normative data. We have normative data for grip strength, but not for the other measures, really. We need to manage what's the stature, gender, and region-dependent measures. Are they really relevant in clinical practice? What does really predict outcomes? Are different aspects of the definition defining or predicting different outcomes, or the link is different for different outcomes? Also, what are the kinetic of muscle loss? And what outcomes are sensitive to treatment? For instance, if you measure muscle strength is a bad test for measuring interventions, because it's quite unresponsive, or response very low. So it's not your favorite if you're doing a clinical trial, but we don't know exactly which ones. The 400-meter test is being used in research, and the European Medicine Agency is exploring if this test is acceptable for drug trials. So we have to look for the right trials, but again, which ones are good in clinical practice and which ones are good in research? And still that's an open question. So to finish, these are the 4 aspects I want to summarize of the new definition. First, low muscle strength first. Second, this time we have cutoff points that are very clear and simple to remember, even if not so scientific. Third, we propose a new algorithm to use in clinical practice. And fourth, we define acute and chronic sarcopenia. Finally, some advertising. I'm the editor of this journal, the Journal of the European Geriatric Medicine Society. And as you see, here is Idenori Arai, who's the editor for Frailty and Sarcopenia. So you have to be very nice to Idenori. I think he was around here, because he's the one who will decide if we publish a paper. And we welcome your papers on this topic, because both Idenori and myself, and also other associate editors, are very keen of the field of sarcopenia and frailty. So papers are welcome. And on behalf of the group, both the writing group and extended group, because I'm here not as an individual, but on behalf of a group of very, very strong and potent minds. Thank you.